The Oak Ridge Reservation holds an important place in our nation's history, and it continues to be a vital part of our national security and scientific research community. But parts of the reservation require cleanup as a result of decades of energy research. The U.S. Department of Energy looks to the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board as the voice of the community on environmental issues. You're welcome to attend meetings of the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board to learn more. Call us or visit our website.
For those of you that don't know me, I'm Dennis Wilson. I'm the new chair,
The chair will direct you.
of the Oak Ridge ORSSAB. We just had our election last month, and we have new installation of officers. This evening, first off, I'd like to ask everybody to turn their phones off to make sure that we have a peaceful meeting. Thank you very much. And first announcement is the next meeting is Wednesday, November 8th, and the topic will be Environmental Management Complex Overview, and it's the Dave Adler Show again. It's a great overview for those of you that haven't heard Dave speak about it before. Next order of business is Dave Adler is going to introduce the new members.
Good evening, everybody. We have quite a few new members, so if you guys will just bear with me, I'm going to plow through a description of each one's background, and then we can all applaud one another and welcome one another to the board. Okay. But as I mention your name, if you'd be so kind as to raise your hand so people can associate names with faces. David Branch. Where are you at, David? Hi, Dave. Lives in Knoxville and was a rural letter carrier for the U.S. Postal Service in Knoxville for 20 years until his retirement in 2013. Previously employed in the healthcare field and studied nursing at Walter State Community College in Morristown. David has been a longtime follower of the SSAB and served a brief term on the board in 2008. My recollection is that back then, because you were also a federal employee, you were not allowed to continue on, which is silly, so I'm glad you had the perseverance to come back. Michelle Lohman. Hi, Michelle. Lives in Lenoir City and is the Human Resources Director for the U.S. Cellular, excuse me. Previously, she was the program manager for the University Recruiting and Graduate Education Programs for Oak Ridge National Lab/UT. Shelley is a member of the United Way of Greater Knoxville. Leon Shields lives in Lenoir City and is a supervisor for field operations for the Lenoir City Utilities Board. He is also the owner of Instructional Concepts, which provides training in firearms, explosives, and rescue operations. He is a firearms instructor for the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office, a firefighter director with the Loudoun County Fire Rescue, chairman of the Lenoir City Planning Commission's Board of Zoning Appeals, a commissioner with the Lenoir City Housing Authority Rural Development Program, and a commissioner with the Loudoun County Regional Planning Commission. Busy enough. Thank you for making time to also participate on the SSAB Day. Leon. Bonnie Shoemaker. Hi, Bonnie. Retired in 2008 after 34 years at the East Tennessee Technology Park, probably called K-25 for most of her career, and Oak Ridge National Laboratory, working in a variety of capacities, including chemical laboratory analyst, environmental compliance specialist, plant shift superintendent, emergency management specialist, and engineering technician. She is the recipient of 2 awards for operations and technical support in environmental compliance and emergency management. Bonnie lives in Clinton. And John Tapp. Hello, John. John lives in Powell and is a retired civil and environmental engineer with nearly 50 years of experience in all areas of environmental protection and restoration. John most recently worked for HDR Engineering, where he provided consulting services in a broad range of areas, including environmental permitting and interaction with state and federal regulatory agencies. He's also a founding partner in Commonwealth Technology, a large environmental and engineering consulting firm. And then there is an additional person, Tara Walker, who's not here tonight, and we'll welcome her next time. So if we could just say hi and clap for all the new members. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dave.
I guess I'm.
Now we have comments from the Deputy Designated Federal Officer, EPA and TDEC,
And that's.
Dave Adler.
I'm it tonight because Jay's tied up. Not a lot to report on tonight. Much of what I would normally discuss in these opening comments, I'm going to touch on in the briefing, so I won't belabor those points. But there have been a couple of significant accomplishments I want to make sure we call out. Yesterday, the Secretary of Energy transmitted what's called the land transfer package for Duck Island from the Department of Energy to Congress. So that's about a 200-acre tract of land out at the East Tennessee Technology Park that will be, assuming everything goes well with congressional review, and historically it always has, that will be transferred to Crowett. And that's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big chunk of land that has some options for potential industrial development and so forth. A second large tract was actually a week ago Friday conveyed via deed transfer to Crowett, and that's a site called the K3133 site, also around 200 acres, big flat site. I showed it to most of you who participated in the recent tours. We'll talk more about that tonight too, but that one is actually now at the end of the road. It's gone through all the processes of achieving blessing, actually a letter from the governor of the state of Tennessee, EPA, congressional review, DOE's, Hall of Knives, everything. So that's a big deal. So two big parcels of land have now made significant progress towards privatization and redevelopment. Aside from that, I don't think I have any additional comments, so I can't weave into tonight's presentation.
Okay.
So.
Thank you, Dave. Nima, are you online?
Yes, I'm on the line.
Okay. Do you have any comments this evening?
Well, my name is Nima Itachi. I'm a new project manager that's been involved on the EP site, and I'm sitting in for Connie right now. I think she unfortunately couldn't make it on this call, but I don't have any announcements. But if you have any questions or comments, I can definitely forward them to her.
Okay.
So.
Thank you. Christoph.
I have no comments or announcements, but like always, I welcome any questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cameron, public comment?
The public comment period is now open. We have 3 commenters. Oh. We have 3 people that want to comment: Luther Gibson, Ken Mays, and Mr. Stokes. So please state your name and keep your comments to 3 minutes.
Micah, yeah.
I'm Luther Gibson. I was chairman of the board 2001 and 2, on the board from 99 to 05. Recently retired from CNS 112 after 40 years on various Oak Ridge M&O contracts. The other day, last Wednesday, in fact, I was sitting at home, and about 11 o'clock, I heard the public warning sirens go off, and I knew Wednesday was for testing, but I thought they were supposed to be at like 12 o'clock. There's a window of like 11 to 2, and I should have known that from being in both the 112 and ETTP ERO. But looking through Mr. Adler's presentation tonight, perhaps he can address, the vision as to when we might not be able to hear the public warning sirens out there in Sector E or K, based on a release from ETTP, if he could include that. And also another piece of anecdotal information. I was going through YouTube and looking at some videos of the excursion train, which doesn't run any longer because of liability issues. Found it rather striking. We have a picture over here of these tank cars that sit out there, all kinds of flammables, and some of them are empty, of course. It's unclear which ones are the flammables and corrosives. That's I guess I'm trying to make a troll comment, to get some discussion started while we can have the excursion trained. Anyhow, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Lloyd Stokes, resident in Oak Ridge since 1944. Worked 40 years, 3 plants, and retired 19 years ago. And I guess most of my efforts have been on historic preservation and representing Oak Ridge Heritage and Preservation Association. Attended most of the consultation meetings and every other meeting that we've had concerning K-25 and MC and other issues. What I feel like we need, the new people that are here, we need to have, I guess, a background at these meetings. I see a lot of new faces, and I wonder how many people know what we've done over since 2004. DOE efforts and preservationists and other groups that have been here to preserve the history of our Manhattan Project. And myself, the MOA concerning K-25 specifies that reports be given out every 6 months. That would be a big help to those of us that are not in contact every day. To give, I guess, the new participants a copy of the MOA for the Heritage and Preservation would be a big benefit to bring everyone up to date and up to speed on how long and where we are to the preservation efforts and what DOE has done, the progress they make, and what they intend to do in the future on land transfers, the tower, history center, the equipment building. I suppose I haven't seen anything as of late, and would like an update of where we are on our preservation of K-25. There's a lot of issues that need to be addressed. K-25 land transfer is a big issue. I know I watched city council meeting last night, and they're working with, I guess, Croat on K-25 to get tax abatement. But still, I'm not hearing anything on the part we need to set aside for preservation. We've got a lot of work to do. Walking trails is another thing, the signage, equipment building, the status of the equipment. I was on the, I guess, equipment collection committee. That's been years ago, and we have an update. We have reviewed that update, but I'd like to know the status of that and where we're going with that. But communication, I see a need for a better communication between the citizens. I'd like to see some publicity for DOE and involved parties. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Just real quick, I just want to make sure we clarify this. I'm Chuck Hope, Oak Ridge City Council member. Monday night we approved the resolution that allows us to work with Croat and the Industrial Development Board on land transfer. So the land, once it is transferred from DOE into Croat's possession, it becomes a taxable property, and therefore we're allowing that to go transfer on through to the Industrial Development Board and hold it there so that there won't be taxes built onto that. That way we can go ahead and continue to work on site preparation and continue to market that property and put it back onto the private property or private market.
Thank you.
So are there any other comments? All right. As a Citizens Advisory Board to the Department of Energy on environmental cleanup, we want to encourage the community at large to attend and participate in our board and committee meetings. If you are unable to attend, please send in your questions and comments to the address shown. Appropriate comments and questions will be read during the public comment section of the SSAB meeting and will be given the same consideration by the board and DOE as those given in person. Meeting schedules and ways to communicate with the board can be obtained by calling 241-4583 or by visiting our website.
This evening's presentation by Dave Adler is Vision 2020. You want to introduce him?
Okay, I'd like to go ahead and introduce David Adler. David serves as the Director of the Quality and Mission Support Division for the Oak Ridge Office of Environmental Management. In his more than 25 years at DOE, he has focused primarily on activities related to contaminated site cleanup, waste management and disposition, and most recently on efforts to reindustrialize the former K-25 facility in Oak Ridge. Dave holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Rutgers University and a master's degree in toxicology from the University of Michigan. Dave.
Thank you. I'll start by saying this presentation was initially to be given by Wendy Kane, the Federal Project Director, but she's been shipped out to Las Vegas for a while, so I'm pinch hitting for her, but I hope to be able to provide a meaningful presentation to you anyway. All right. Basically, I wanted to do tonight is talk at a high level about the status and progress of our efforts to convert the East Tennessee Technology Park from an old DOE uranium enrichment facility to something else that is of value to the community. We're going for kind of a threefold end state. We want to make sure that the historical events that took place at the site are appropriately commemorated. We also want to make sure that any redevelopable land that can be reused for economic development is put into that reuse. And there's also a lot of conservation potential out there and recreation potential. So we think there's a lot of good things that could happen out there, and we're steadily making progress towards each. We call it Vision 2020. And it's good to have kind of a driver. And Jay Mullis really is pushing us all hard to try and come up with a completion focus, so that by the end of 2020, essentially all of the surface features that need to be removed have been removed, the soils that need to be cleaned up have been cleaned up, and essentially all of the land has been transferred to some new reuse state. So that's what Vision 2020 is all about. Now, we're not going to have absolutely everything done by then, but we're targeting to get a lot done. And the three big goals I just discussed, the building's gone, the soil dug, the land's transferred, are certainly well within our reach. We've been working on this site now for, 20 years. So it's kind of exciting to be part of the final 10 yards. So let me jump in and talk about them some. That's just an overview picture of the site as it existed several years ago. It's changed quite a bit. We'll show you some of that. This is the way we hope the site will look in a very short period of time. This misses an airport. Actually, I guess the airport would show up to the right anyway, but we like to think that we're going to have all the buildings gone. As I mentioned, a national park facility located up in the center of the site, and then a bunch of land suitable for development. What we'd really like to see is, instead of green fields, manufacturing facilities and jobs, jobs, jobs. So we're working on that. Again, another artist's rendition of the site. Actually, that's not an artist's rendition. That's a helicopter's rendition of the site as it existed back in, not that long ago, about 10 or 15 years ago. The K-25 building was still there. All the major gaseous diffusion process buildings were in place, and we had a lot of work to do. Of course, there again, that's what it would look like later. The work that remains to be done, as I've mentioned a couple times now, is we need to tear down a relatively small number of buildings. We've got the gaseous diffusion centrifuge plant test facilities in this corner of the site. They're still there. We have a fair amount of soil and groundwater work to do, but that's underway now. There's a lot of soil being dug right now. In fact, we just finished up a couple of burial grounds. Groundwater is going to be a challenge. There's definitely contaminated groundwater out there. I'll get into this in more detail in a moment, but our ability to purify all the water out there is probably limited by technical constraints, but we're going to see what we can do, and we're working with EPA and TDEC to figure out what a reasonable approach for groundwater is out there. And of course, we have to transfer all the land. We're working with the city of Oak Ridge, who's, in addition to Croat, kind of a primary partner in realizing our vision. Working with the city of Oak Ridge to get infrastructure transferred over. Once the roads are in suitable shape for the city to accept them, the city has been very much a partner. The electrical infrastructure, the storm water, the water supply, the sewage and all that needs to be transferred over so that DOE is pretty much done with the site. Okay, this is a site that allows you kind of at a glance to see how much of the buildings are gone. Everything in green is gone. So just on a rough eyeballing, you can see that the big heavy lifts are essentially all gone now. I'd argue that the centrifuge facility again, and back here, the old facility where they manufactured a lot of the industrial workings that occupied those big green buildings, they're still left. They're still pretty big jobs. Got an area over here we'll refer to from time to time. I don't need this anymore. I'm just going to use my arm rather than the pointers because I wouldn't trust myself with that laser. This is an area we call Poplar Creek facilities. We're working on them now. The buildings that are in brown are buildings that have actually been leased. They serve some continuing use for somebody. So they've been sold to Croat or leased out to some other private entity. There's one oddball right here that's currently leased out to Centrus, which is a private company that's exploring gaseous centrifuge technology as a means of delivering the future's enriched uranium. They're still using that building, but we're working to bring that activity to closure too, so they don't have a big building in the middle of the national park. So you can tell just from the pictures we're making good progress. Most of the big buildings are green. A fair number have been transferred out and are being put back to reuse. Got a relatively small amount in yellow still to be demolished. So reasonable expectation that they can be demolished by 2020 if we can continue to enjoy the funding levels that we've had for the past few years. All right. This slide's a little busy, but it gives you a sense of how much soil remains to be cleaned. Generally speaking, the areas that are in yellow have been through the soil characterization, cleanup, and validation process. So those areas have been cleared of contamination. The little green things you see here are not areas of residual contamination. Those are wetlands. So basically this area, and most of the land up there at the top of the site have been cleared. There are some exceptions, but it's mostly been cleared. And the work that remains, actually this area now, has been cleared. That's the piece of property I mentioned we just transferred over to Croat. This slide's a little out of date. Here, we still have a lot of soil clearing work to do. As I mentioned before, we are also working on some groundwater decisions that need to be made for the site. Most of the groundwater challenges are limited to this area. I've got a slide in a minute that'll talk about that. In fact, this is that slide. So again, same aerial schematic of the site. These areas I've often referred to these areas as the big three, 200 acres, 200 acres, about 400 acres. These 200 transferred to Croat a week ago. These 200 acres notified Congress yesterday that we want to transfer them. That's the final step in the process. This area left to go, this area, a lot of work to do. The oddly shaped green, yellow, and red areas are areas where we have known groundwater contamination problems. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, that's a tough challenge in a geology like ours and with the types of historic challenges that are left behind by all the industrial practices that took place there from the 40s into the 80s. This area in particular is a challenging groundwater problem where we actually have something called DNAPLs. English is degreasing solvents that have been dropped into burial grounds, have percolated down through the unsaturated column of the soil and have settled down upon and within the bedrock down low. That's a tricky problem to solve, but we're looking hard now at, actually we're just now wrapping up some characterization activity so that we can precisely define where it is and is not. And then they're looking at experimenting with some thermal treatment technologies that would basically drive these materials off if it works. It's very expensive. It's a lot of uncertainty associated with that technology, but we're looking at the feasibility of doing that. The other areas generally are devoid of significant groundwater problems. Like any industrial site in the state, we've probably got 300 or 400 wells out there, so we've spent a lot of money dropping wells. We've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sampling events for those wells. When I refer to an area as generally clean, what I'm saying is that there's no established developed plume of contamination. Generally, the water quality comes back at non-detection levels for the analytes of concern. But occasionally you'll get 5 parts per billion of a solvent or 10 parts per billion of something else. They'll come and go. I'm not going to drag you through all the data, but that's fairly typical of properties in East Tennessee that have had some industrial history. So it's pretty good, pretty good. And the pretty good areas are here, most of that. This is an area where there is a plume. It's easy to understand why there was a plume. The 1078 burial ground was basically used to dispose of raw solvents at times. So we know why it's contaminated there. Luckily, most of that plume, particularly the areas that are in green, are at contaminant levels that hover around drinking water standards. So not too bad. Appears to be solving itself through time and decay and dilution probably. But back at the main plant, some pretty tough challenges. Okay, a little bit of graphical representation of where we've made progress in transferring land. I've talked about the big three enough. Let's talk a little bit about the interior of the site. This area in the center of the site is the area that we've entered into the MOA that was just discussed to preserve for purposes of commemorating the Manhattan Project. The other areas in blue, I guess I don't have a legend, I should have a legend, but this area has been sold. Actually, it was accessed via the General Services Administration and sold on the open market. I think that's about 300 acres. These areas in blue have been transferred to Crowett. There's an area in this portion of the site that is ready to go. We've got all the environmental work done, and it's under consideration for a small, medium-sized airport called a General Aviation Airport. So there's a big push right now to put in about a 5,000-foot runway. It would be a part of the Metropolitan Knoxville Airport Authority's domain, the same people that run McGee-Tyson Airport in Knoxville and the Island Home Airport in the river in downtown Knoxville would also run this airport. They've actually made a lot of progress. They're working with the Federal Aviation Administration on a design, and it's possible there will be an airport out there over the next few years. We'll see. It costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of approvals, but it's not an unrealistic vision for some people at this point. To have that airport would be a wonderful thing a potentially wonderful thing for the industries out there, because some of the industries that are being targeted by Crowett and other outfits are industries that benefit from the presence of an airport, such as just-in-time delivery systems. Some of the medical products fields produce products that have shelf half-lives. Sometimes shelf half-lives that are only hours. So they want to be able to fly products out very quickly. So see how that goes. A few more aerial shots. This is the southern end of Duct Island, the property the Secretary of Energy just asked Congress to allow us to transfer. On the lower side is the K3133 site that was just transferred to Crowett. That's about, the lower one is about 200 acres. I'd like to say, and I think and hope it's true, that it's one of the few really large, flat, ready-to-go sites in the Anderson, Knox, Roane County area. Technically, it's in Roane County. It's got a lot of attractive features. It's got a barge terminal immediately next door. It has very rapid access to the interstate. Because of the site's industrial history, they can bring enormous quantities of power to the site. And it also has a railroad transfer yard immediately next door, but this area here is actually a rail line, comes in from the main line to here. So you can connect from that site to New Orleans or New York or wherever you want to go by train or barge, and of course the interstate. So now that I've talked about all the great things about the site, it does have some challenges. It's a former DOE uranium production facility, so it's got the stigma. There's not really an environmental issue, but it does have stigma issues that we have to overcome. And there are some subsurface foundations and such that any site that wanted to, any entity that wanted to come onto the site and develop would have to work around. It's a brownfield site, but the idea is that a lot of these brownfield sites can provide a useful launch pad for manufacturing industries and so forth. So fingers crossed that can unfold over the next several years. I mentioned earlier that we were working in collaboration with the city to get all the infrastructure transferred over. We've already, and in fact it was a few years ago, we transferred a fire station on site from DOE to the city. So now rather than have our own fire station providing services, fire protection services to our activities on site, we buy those services from the city of Oak Ridge, and that actually works out best for everybody. It's financially to everybody's advantage. It certainly is attractive to DOE because we're steadily backing away from the site and leaving the site. So it's useful to have an excellent fire protection system out there. That again makes it attractive for industries because it keeps their fire insurance costs low and so forth. The next slide's really busy, and I don't think you can really follow it, but the red lines and the yellow lines and all the lines on the side are water lines, sewer lines, potable water supplies, and roads and such that have been transferred to the city. I think the basic status of things is that the sanitary sewer lines have all been transferred. Some of the water supply lines have been transferred. A significant amount, but not all of the electrical supply lines have been transferred, and we're working those hard. Okay. I mentioned earlier that we wanted to, I wonder if I can turn it. Can this light get turned down a little bit so that the things show up better, Pete? Or are we stuck with it? Does that mess up you guys with the videography? I'd like to turn it down just a little bit for this one slide. That's better. Thank you. Okay. These are all artists' renditions of the commemorative systems that we're building out there over time to ensure that there's a good representation of the important contribution that this site made really to the history of the world. Starting up in the upper right-hand corner, that's the fire station. And we're working with the city to build a small museum into an area of the fire station that they no longer require. They've got their trucks, and Oak Ridge is bravest in this area. We can use this area up here to put in an indoor museum that visitors will be able to go to and understand the details of the site's history, small displays, small technology displays, etc. The plan also includes developing a larger facility that would capture replicas of the equipment that was used to enrich uranium. And then the pad itself is being preserved, and there's a plan to have a series of exhibits that actually are available outside too. I thought the idea by Mr. Stokes to share the MOA was an excellent one. And Steve, if we could follow up on that, let's just make sure that the board has a summary. I won't go into as much detail now, but a summary of all the things that are committed to in the memorandum of agreement for preservation of the site. There's actually an upcoming event hosted jointly by DOE and the City of Oak Ridge. It's kind of a ribbon cutting for the progress we're making on the History Center, and it's open to the public generally, but I'm terrible with dates and times. Steve, 21st? Somebody knows it?
19th.
I'll tell you.
Okay.
2 to 4.
19th at 2 to 4. You sound very certain of yourself, so I'm going to trust that. Okay, thanks. So anybody that wants to come out to that, please feel free. You'll be able to walk around and get a feel for what the facility is going to look like as it's completed. And then last but not least, the conservation opportunities out at the site. It really does have wonderful areas for conservation and recreational opportunity. A lot of people see them as areas, well, they're no good for development. Well, true, you can't build factories and wetlands, but you can have bird watching trails, you can have mountain biking trails, and we've got a lot of that out there. To the north of the site is about a 3,000 acre area called the Black Oak Ridge Conservation Easement. If anybody is looking for a great place to see the fall colors or to ride a mountain bike, it's really a state-class recreation area. It's managed in coordination with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, and it houses what's known as the North Boundary Trail System. That's a picture of a bunch of volunteers helping to build a mountain bike trail. There's also an excellent wetlands walk that you can take that is along the banks of the Clinch River. It's a great place for waterfowl and so forth. And there will be more to come. We're looking at setting up a blue wave for canoeists and all kinds of good things. So that's coming along. And then that's just the wrap-up slide. I think I've covered the basics. I'd like to take a few minutes to see if I could answer questions that people have about the status of things, and I'll sit down. So any questions?
Bonnie?
Oh,
Is the K-1515C?
no, actually, the protocol, no big deal, is we raise our little things up, but no. So ask your question. No, we got protocol out of the way, I'm sorry.
Is the K-1515C facility, the sanitary water, is that transferred to the city as well?
I think that the sanitary water treatment facility is actually just being demolished. There's not a continuing need for that, so the city really doesn't have an interest in it. So we're putting systems in place that would allow sewage from the site to be conveyed to other treatment systems. There's actually there's sanitary treatment systems right across the river at Rarity Ridge and elsewhere. So
Okay.
it's just being cleaned up. And
But what about the sewer plant? Is it still?
the sewer, that whole area is down on the Poplar, you're talking about down the part, yeah, that's all being basically decommissioned and removed.
Ed? Excuse me, after the board finishes.
We'll get to everybody though, sir.
We'll get to everybody.
Well, yeah.
Thank you. Ed?
Yeah, right there.
Here.
Can they use the buses?
Of course you can.
Thanks, Dave. That was, especially the part of the Croat was pretty illuminating to me anyway. Say, I got a question on one of the slides, I think it was 3, where you mentioned that the groundwater issue probably will persist beyond the 2020, right?
Sure. Groundwater, if we come up with ways of restoring that groundwater, which we may or may not be able to do, candidly, they will take time to implement. So what we do when we transfer property is we build into the deed prohibitions on groundwater use so that no one can be harmed by the groundwater, nor can anyone put in wells and drag plumes around and exacerbate the current situation. So we can definitely prevent public health issues. That we've got that part covered. The issue is whether or not we can restore the resource to its original water quality, and that's what we're looking at. But it takes time. Yeah.
And hopefully, I guess we discussed this in the last environmental management committee that we had about the seriousness of what happens after 2020. But I guess it's going to be year by year.
Well, DOE will be signing records of decision for groundwater.
Right.
And those are binding contracts between DOE and the state of Tennessee and the Environmental Protection Agency. Those will require whatever is required to ensure that things are kept safe. And that probably means some type of ongoing stewardship program at a minimum. Money to monitor and prevent use and anything that's necessary to make sure that issues are managed. And it'll likely go on for a long time.
Okay. A couple more,
Yeah.
please. The other one was on slide 7, you talked about the integration of the MKA's airport planning.
Mm-hmm.
What is the approximate timeline on that?
The master plan, in effect, the design for the airport is with the FAA now for their review. It's reasonable to assume they will give their comments and perhaps a thumbs up or thumbs down over the next year, possibly sooner than that. But airport planning is a complicated business, so I don't want to state too aggressive a goal for them, but certainly within the next year. If that were to occur and it were an approval, they could be moving dirt, within a year after that. So it's it's an airport that really could exist in the 2020 timeframe. But there are a lot of things that could push that forward, pull it out, but certainly years, few years.
Lastly, Dave, in terms of the museum on the history, at the History Center, is there any integration with the Science Museum of Oak Ridge at all?
Yes. Basically, the general thinking for commemorating the Manhattan Project history in Oak Ridge has been, you may have heard it, a hub and spoke concept. We're working closely with the National Park Service because what they do is interpret history. DOE will retain ownership of the facilities which exist at Oak Ridge National Lab, Y12, and K25. DOE is working on basically a relocation, and apparently we're retaining the name American Museum of Science and Energy, but they're looking at a relocation of the function provided by that facility, or at least some of it, to another location in the new downtown, whatever we call the downtown area. It's an upgraded mall. It's very nice, and there's a nice storefront that's they're designing the hub, if you will, for the DOE thing. And then the Park Service is also at least building a temporary location in another location in Oak Ridge. So basically it will be possible for visitors from out of town to come into the center of town, hopefully rent a hotel room and eat a dinner, but also get information on all the facilities available in the surrounding area and then go to them and visit them.
All right, Dave, thanks.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Thank you much. John?
Dave, you mentioned that all the sanitary sewer lines have been transferred, but some of the water lines and some of the electrical had not been. What is the impediment to getting those transferred also?
We have to determine which ones meet code, are of interest to the city. Some of them are water lines that really go to DOE's old facilities that have been removed and that the city doesn't want to take on a maintenance responsibility for, which is logical because they're trying to protect the ratepayers in the city of Oak Ridge. And why would they do that for an old line that needs repair and goes nowhere? So we're working through all that right now. It's just the logistics of making sure that the department's interests and the city's interests are captured in the transfer process.
Is it possible you're going to replace lines for the city that they want to take over may not meet code?
There have been instances where DOE saves money by abandoning and replacing some lines. So where we can justify improvements, we do that. But we also have to be very careful because we get money appropriated from Congress to clean things up. And we have to be careful not to have mission creep off into explicit infrastructure development and economic development. There's a zone where common sense and partnership is available to us and appropriate, but we have to be careful not to just launch, massive infrastructure works. So the answer to your question is yes. For example, in the, I believe, right up the center of the site, when DOE looked at the value of getting things transferred over and the cost of simply creating a new line up the center of the site, we concluded that it was in our interest to actually build a new line and then transfer that to the city. So that has happened. So,
in terms of the airport, if the FAA approves it, do they finance it, or how's the financing come about?
it would be probably a combination of state and federal financing. Federal financing, of course, is getting hard to get. So the people advancing the idea would be seeking funding from the state government of Tennessee, and then to a lesser, much lesser extent from the Federal Aviation Administration. And then ultimately there are user fees and hangar rentals and fuel sales and things of that sort.
Thank you. Belinda?
Hey, Dave, a couple of questions. Would you mind going to slide number 6? That's the groundwater status
Not at
slide.
all.
Thank you. You addressed a couple of the plumes there. You talked about the solvent plume at the K1070 location, and then the DNAPL plume there in the middle. Could you just, for everyone's information here, just address what is the primary contaminant at some of the other plumes
Sure.
that are shown on there?
Sure. I'll make it quick, but generally our issue is solvents. Degreasing solvents that were used to maintain equipment, normal contents of some fuels and things of that sort. So it's compounds like trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene. If you go to AutoZone and buy gunk out, that's what you're looking at. And a surprisingly small quantity of that can actually yield a lot of contaminated groundwater if you're concerned about parts per billion. So here, it's basically industrial solvents. there. It's basically industrial solvents. There may be some metals, but it's primarily industrial solvents. Same thing here. Here there was an old burn pit, demolition area, same thing. Here, this little green blob that you may not even be able to see is actually a location. Just down here there's a spring that most of the time is under the water table, because when Watts Bar is doing its job and the water levels are high, it's below the water table and you really can't see anything. When it drops down and the spring is daylighted, you can measure water in the spring and you have a solvent level that's right around drinking water standards, sometimes lower, sometimes higher. So it's hard to get too worked up about that, because practical matter is the river, it's massively diluted, and it's almost drinkable coming out of the ground. We have a similar situation off in here. But it's basically, the answer is solvents, solvents, solvents. The same type of thing that's what's not unique to this facility. If you go to any industrial facility where they have spilled solvents, you find solvents in the ground. They last for a long time. They do slowly decay, but since the environmental challenges probably were presented in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it can take a few decades for them to decay on their own. And then you can accelerate that sometimes with active engineered measures to pull the water out and purify it. So we're looking at all those options.
Thanks. And just for everyone's information that's here, we'll have in June 2018, one of the subject, or the subject of our meeting at that time will be the ongoing groundwater efforts. So if anyone who's in the audience is particularly interested in groundwater, put June 2018 on your calendar. And I have one other question, if I may.
Sure.
The K25 Virtual Museum, what's the future of that with respect to, is it going to be something that's ongoing, or is it going to go away?
I'm going to let Steve Cook, who's not expecting this, answer that question. Steve Cook works for us at DOE, and he's our program manager for historic preservation activities at ETTP. So, Steve.
Great.
Yeah, what you're referring to is the facility on the second floor of the fire station that Dave was referring to?
Actually, no, the virtual museum that's online.
Oh, the virtual museum.
Yes.
Okay, that's online.
Yes.
That was launched in November 2015 with the establishment of the Manhattan National Historic Park. There is interest in doing updates periodically. We don't have that scoped out yet, so we're working on that.
Okay. So you're saying that it will actually continue as an entity, even with these physical museums when they're in place?
Oh, yes.
Okay, thank you.
John?
Thanks.
You mentioned in terms of groundwater contamination that you're looking at drinking water standards.
Yeah, that's my
primarily.
question.
Had you given consideration that if the plumes migrate into surface water, then you could be looking at a much more stringent requirement
We
to
do.
protect the fish and wildlife?
Right, and I actually only offer up drinking water standards as a kind of a benchmark perspective. There's the drinking water standards, strictly speaking, are legally applicable to public drinking water supplies. So the water fountain out here, the tap in our home, or any actual wellhead that provides water to more than 15 homes, those are required to meet drinking water standards. It's a common practice to say, well, if the world were our oyster and we had all the money in the world, we'd love to have the groundwater in situ meet those standards, so you could drop a straw in any well anywhere in North America and be able to drink the water. That's not a realistic goal. Generally what happens at the groundwater surface water interface, if you could picture kind of like if you took a sponge and soaked it in water and set it on the table, very small, relatively small quantities of water would slowly ooze out of the side of the sponge, but if you put a river flowing right past it, you actually get massive dilution. So our typical experience is that you can see your parts per billion or parts per million in the groundwater. You might see it right at the fringe of the surface water body that intercepts it, but if you move just a little ways away, you're back to non-detectable or background areas. So generally, the groundwater contamination issues are an issue for use of the groundwater resource and not an issue for use of the aquatic resource, the surface water resource. There are some limited exceptions to that. Out at Hanford, there's a case where they believe that the upwelling of groundwater into the banks of the Columbia River may be having some impact on breeding behaviors of certain species right there at the edge. Here, we don't really see that. Limited exceptions here. There are a couple cases where we exceed water quality criteria for small reaches of stream. But for the most part, I think the way to look at the groundwater challenge is that it is just that. It's a groundwater challenge, and it prevents reuse of the water without treatment. In some, well, I won't say it's a good thing, but as a practical thing, the presence of a surface water body adjacent to your groundwater problem provides a partial or maybe complete intercept of the problem and keeps it from spreading, because it hits the surface water and then is quickly diluted. Now, we all know dilution isn't the preferred solution to pollution,
Right.
and it's not the way you would design something, but it is the situation we find ourselves with these legacy challenges sometimes.
Okay. Bonnie?
My question was pretty much the same as John's, because water quality criteria is much more stringent than drinking water.
They certainly can be, because sometimes the standards necessary to protect aquatic life are actually lower, particularly if your concern is having people eat those aquatic life than what's required for drinking water.
So is there still like MPDS monitoring or
There's all
toxic?
kinds of monitoring, yeah. We've got
And
lots and lots of monitoring of the surface water and all the stormwater.
So it's still under a permit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Ed?
They've always thinking on potential recommendations. See, I have seen a kind of high level of schedule in the groundwater strategy document. Is that high level of schedule somehow matching or accommodate the date of Vision 2020? Because I see some raw records of decisions in there that are much further out.
Right. Well, part of our vision is that by 2020, we would be well on our way to at least making decisions for what we're going to do with the groundwater. And
For the ROD.
For the ROD, right, which translates into a record of decision. Now, you'd think, well, big deal, they're going to make a decision in 3 years. You'd be surprised how hard it is to make decisions for groundwater. It's underground. It's difficult to characterize. Hydrogeologists like a lot of information before they make decisions. But our goal is to try and get decisions made. And we're actually working with Christoph and his gang and the EPA folk, trying to float some test efforts at making decisions. We're going to convene ourselves in about a month and look real hard at all the available information for this 200-acre parcel and see if we can come up to a agreement on how to proceed with that site. And hopefully that one's easy because it doesn't really have any contamination. There's a little bit of chromates here and odds and ends, but no developed plume. So we're hoping that we can look at all the data and come up with a decision on how to manage that. But it's hard. Groundwater decision making has been difficult because you're collaborating with a lot of people and there's a lot of uncertainty. It's easy to keep people safe from contaminated groundwater. It's hard to make decisions on how to restore it.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from the board? Are there questions from the audience?
Mr. Stokes.
I've got a concern. The facilities ground that we turn over to other people, other entities, what radioactive and chemical characterization has been done on those facilities? I know we have sewage and utility water going to the city. Will that be certified clean or exempted, as you mentioned a while ago? How will that? I know the city of Oak Ridge is spending about $34 million on sewer upgrades.
Sure.
Of course, excuse me. There will not be a need probably for sewage in most places out there, but how will that contaminated chemically and radioactively properties be characterized and to make the people know?
Great
And
question.
I guess the second question would be riverfront, White Oak Legacy, all the way down the river, both sides in the I guess, deposit that's there. How will that be characterized before turning over to the public or for public use?
Okay, let me try and take those in order. Let's start with soil and buildings. Basically, before we can transfer facilities, we have to demonstrate through characterization that the environmental conditions are compatible with whatever the intended reuse is. So what that basically amounts to is they need to be cleaned up. We have to characterize them. If we find anything, we have to clean them up. And then we have to pass both the state of Tennessee's scrutiny, the Environmental Protection Agency's scrutiny. We have, in addition to our own contractors that characterize, we have an independent contractor that comes in and just does a completely independent review of that data. Once the state technical people, the ones that work for Christoph, are comfortable that the site is clean and meets all applicable cleanup standards, they prepare a letter that actually has to go all the way through the governor of the state of Tennessee that says you're good to go. Similar protocol for EPA. So the basic objective is to, for this site, for ETTP, is to clean it up to conditions that ensure that there are no restrictions on any industrial activity up to a depth of 10 feet, okay? In a lot of areas, and that's generally enough to lay utilities, dig foundations, do that type of thing. It's also enough that you're probably ensuring you're getting all the contamination because it starts at the top. When you measure it and it peters out at 6 feet, you can be pretty comfortable it's not there at 10 feet. So for soils, there's a very, very thorough multi-party protocol in place to make sure that we don't transfer things that can't be allocated for unrestricted use. If there is something like a burial ground or something of that sort, that has to be carved in, that has to be built into deeds, and restrictions on their excavation use are put in place. We also have requirements for what are called excavation penetration permitting programs, so that if anyone is in an area where there are restrictions, say below 10 feet, they have to go through a process where we look at the data again, make sure that's an area where it's okay for them to actually dig below 10 feet. So we've got a pretty good thing in place for the soils. For sewer and water transfer, the city, again, multiple layers. Basically, again, we have to convince ourselves, EPA and TDEC have to be convinced, and in the case of things that are transferred to the city has to be convinced, because the city has no interest in taking on DOE's old environmental liabilities. So it's actually a multi-phase activity there too. So anything that makes it through the transfer process should be in pretty good shape, and a lot of documentation available to public record to demonstrate that. And it's based on data. You know, it's actually based on millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of characterization data. So your second question concerned White Oak Lake and the sediments that have come down from that. What Mr. Stokes is referring to is some historic releases that actually occurred from Oak Ridge National Lab upriver in the Clinch. And there were discharges of strontium and cesium that hit the Clinch, and in some cases, at really quite low levels, can be detected in sediments at the base of the Clinch and further down. For those, we actually signed a record of decision that concluded it was not desirable to try and dig those sediments up. The measured values in those sediments are above, in some isolated areas, are above background, but not significantly above background. And I know that's a subjective term, but if background's 1x, the values we see are 10x-ish. We have a protocol of coordination with the state of Tennessee and the Tennessee Valley Authority that requires that anyone that wants to go in and build a dock or dredge a channel or do anything like that has to submit their permit, their request through, again, a council that looks at the data and consults with them on the advisability of that activity. We've processed a lot of docks, a lot of bridge construction activities and so forth, and have never had to restrict the proceeding with a proposal. So I think we've got a pretty good system in place for that too. The water column itself is good.
The U.S. Department of Energy is cleaning up the Oak Ridge Reservation of residual hazardous and radioactive contamination left over as a result of decades of nuclear energy research. Much of that work has been influenced by the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board, a citizens panel that provides independent advice and recommendations on DOE's cleanup operations. You're welcome to attend the meetings and be part of this important work. For more information, call us or visit our website.